Servus and welcome to another episode of Pro Hockey Pod, episode 63. This week, right back at it again in the NCAA front. This next guest here has a long resume in terms of coaching, whether it's both in the NCAA ranks and also the pro ranks. Talking to people who I know have played for him, they have a lot of respect for this gentleman, and he taught them, most importantly, how to be a pro on the ice, but also off the ice, dress the part, you name it, and prepare them to go into the careers that they've luckily had in their playing days. Happy to have on this week from Minnesota State University, Troy Ward.
Thank you.
We always go back. So at the start, I always go back down memory lane. We always kind of pick up for when everything started for you. So I believe you were born in the North St. Paul, Minnesota area there. What's kind of the first maybe childhood memory you have? And obviously Minnesota being such a passionate state about ice hockey. I mean, it doesn't seem like a shock that you probably get into it at a young age.
Yeah, it's a great way to segue into this. I was they call it the land of 10,000 lakes in Minnesota, and it's some of us that lived there our whole life, we'd say it's the land of 6,000 lakes and 4,000 ponds. But I kind of grew up on a lake but to me it was more of a pond as I've grown through the years. It was a smaller lake, if you would, but I was just fortunate to grow up on water. I started skating when I was basically 1.5, just turning 2. My dad would shovel a rink on this lake, and I just basically go out there. Obviously, I wasn't in school until I was 5, so I skated pretty much every day all winter for basically 3 winters in a row. And by the time I was 5, I was fully a good skater per my age, and I could handle a puck, and it just kind of took off from there. So, and ironically, my dad was a basketball coach and a football coach, but I was a hockey player. But that was part of growing up where we did, and just kind of was a kid that just understood what it was like on the ice, what it was like to be in a cold climate all the time and feel comfortable, and it just never changed for me to this day.
And what was kind of like your minor hockey path like growing up there in Minnesota? Obviously, the high school hockey is a very popular route there. Like what was it like for you?
For me, it was it's a great question. I think it's a pretty cool story. It's more maybe about my dad than myself, but you know, to the point I just made, at 5 years old, when I started playing in-house hockey, I probably peaked at 8. I was probably the best hockey player I ever was at 8, but I was just really ahead of a lot of kids at that time. And, I could score 4 to 6 goals a game in a youth hockey game when I was a mini mite squirt. I was very gifted in terms of, I was just further along than everybody else because I had skated so much as a young man. Um, and at that time in the 70s, you either played in the 60s and 70s, you either played in-house hockey or you could play travel. And I'll never forget it. I was really elevated. So everybody asked my dad, say, hey, will Troy play, double A travel this year? Which instead of playing, let's just say 12 to 16 games a winter, it would have been like 40 games a winter. Well, that was a lot back in the day, obviously life was different then. And my dad said no. He said, one of the things I have to do as a father with my son Troy is just let him enjoy the game, but he has to peak at the right time. He has to love the game at the right time, and I don't really want to overfeed him his whole life, like with 40 games a year. So my dad never let me play travel. He just didn't believe in it. He believed in development and slower development. So I only got to play in-house all the way up till basically a bantam, and that was just before I went to high school hockey in 1978. Um, and his comment always was if you want to play college hockey, you got to love it more than everybody else, both on and off the ice and training and everything else. And so when I got to be a senior in high school, I was done with my senior year, and I wanted it more than anybody else. I felt I was kind of denied a little bit of some things that maybe I was elevated to play earlier in my life, and I just out trained people and ended up playing college hockey for 4 years, and I'm still in the game today because he just kind of fed me at a slow pace with the game. It was really interesting. At the time, I wasn't always happy with my dad, to be honest with you. But in the end, like of all the kids I graduate with, I think I'm the only person that's still involved in the game. I can't get enough of the game. it'll take me until the day I'm gone, but um, it worked out really well for me. And I thought my dad had a good sense of what I needed, how much I needed, and for me to still be involved in the game today. I appreciate what he did for me.
When you were growing up there, like kind of going through the high school years, um, being Canadian, like we're all the first thing that we're talked about is, for me coming from Ontario was the OHL or the CHL.
Hmm.
Obviously in a being an American like yourself, like in America there, college is I'd say more popular, but was there any talk or thought when you were kind of going through high school there of making the jump to the CHL?
Not as much, not at that time. The big thing if you grew up in Minnesota is you grew up wanting to play for the Minnesota Gophers, or most people did. Um, I was interesting. Like I used to cut articles as a kid on the Minnesota North Stars. Like I had more of a dream to play pro hockey and be a Minnesota North Star than I did going to the Minnesota Gophers. And I had a lot of friends that were on my high school team that had like free passes to go to the Gopher games because recruiting was different then, and they were on a pass list because the Gophers wanted to recruit them, teammates of mine. So I went to a lot of Gopher games, but I didn't have any passion for it. And at that particular time for us, at least in the state of Minnesota, like we didn't have, a lot of, I would say, knowledge because we were only paper based. There was no computers. We didn't have a lot of knowledge of the CHL. We didn't really understand it. What we did know is that where we were playing in the state of Minnesota, because you could go to the Minnesota State High School tournament and play in front of 16,000 people. And that was the goal of every kid in Minnesota, was to go to the Minnesota State tournament. No one wanted to leave and play juniors. No one wanted to go to the CHL at that time. It was basically stay and play Minnesota high school, and so that was kind of our focus back then. But that was probably based on no social media and just no exposure to the CHL, at least at my era of time.
That definitely makes sense, especially coming from Minnesota. There, the Gophers. I think I went to Minnesota once when I was like 13, and that was just like the first thing I bought was a Gophers hat. Like not knowing much about about college hockey, but it was just like that was the team, right?
Right.
You end up going Division 3 to University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire.
Yep.
Um, Personally, I have a vendetta against them. My senior year, we played them in the national championship game, and they unfortunately got the best of me when I went to Oswego. So a little bit of resentment there. But how was your experience there? How was your 4 years?
It was awesome. Um, it was awesome. It was just I was very fortunate to play. I think I was the last guy kept in 1980, 81 to make the team. I was very underdeveloped. You're talking like I was literally 5'8", a buck 35. I just basically was getting into puberty at that age, going into college, truthfully. But I could skate at the time. My brain functioned pretty well, so I was fortunate to make the team. Didn't play a lot my first 2 years, only because one, my second year was an injury. Um, Took me out almost the whole year, and then my first year, I just, was too small and just I couldn't contribute enough to play. My last 2 years were wonderful. We were national champs my senior year. I was fortunate to be a leader on the team. Um, but the whole thing, if you take not just hockey and winning a championship, if you take the collegiate atmosphere, the Wisconsin Eau Claire in terms of a school and the size of the school and the town, and it was just a great environment for me personally. And so owe a lot to Eau Claire. I ended up being there for 10 years. I went there and thought I would graduate and just move on. Ended up obviously becoming the coach, but didn't think that would happen, but it was a great place in my life.
So you mentioned like there after obviously playing there, you end up coaching there, starting as an assistant, eventually becoming the head coach. When you were done your 4 years, had you ever thought about trying to go play pro and just see if you could do it for a couple of years, see what happens, or did you know right away, it's better for me to maybe transition into coaching?
Transition into coaching. My dad was a coach, as we talked about, and in different sports, but I just kind of knew my path. He was a phy ed teacher. I got a phy ed degree at Wisconsin Eau Claire. I kind of thought maybe I'd be a high school coach my whole life, and I thought maybe I'll just you know go on and teach and coach high school hockey in Minnesota, like where I grew up. And I got, but I'll tell you what changed was when um, I was the assistant coach. yeah, for the guy that I played for. And then his son was playing for the Wisconsin Badgers. So he would oftentimes leave to go watch his son, and he would leave me with the team. And I was 22 years old, 23. And I'll never forget it. The very first time I really put a whistle on and I was in charge of the whole team by myself, then I knew I knew where I was going. Like that day in my life, I knew I was going to be a head coach, or I wanted to be a head coach. I knew that my playing, everything was done. I just really wanted to be a head coach. And that whole one day of running the practice, which I did a lot that year because he went and saw his son play college hockey. I just knew it at that point in time. So I felt like I was in my environment and I felt really comfortable there. So that was kind of a magical time for me.
I feel like that's such a big step for coaches, especially young coaches, to be able to, in your case, the coach would leave and kind of give you the reins for a practice or two or whatever, and to be able to step in and right away have the confidence to address, whatever it is, 20, 25 guys on the ice and almost get respect and be taken seriously right away. Like that doesn't always
Yep.
happen.
No.
It didn't in my case, for example, because it's a learning curve. But um, from then on, you mentioned you knew you wanted to be in a coaching, and obviously you were there for, as you mentioned, 10 years, including when you played. And then after that, you ended up transitioning back to the D1 or to the D1 rank, sorry, at University of Denver. How did that opportunity come about? And like, was that a step up, would you say, for what you'd been doing the past couple of years?
Yeah, my 3 years at Eau Claire as a head was great. There's no better learning for any coach out there listening. Like, there's no better learning than I always say putting on the dress shoes versus a pair of sneakers. I think anytime you can become a head coach and you can kind of figure it out, because a lot of times it just, as people know today as coaches, it isn't really about X's and O's. I mean, there's some advantages to being a really good X and O coach, but it's really about your DNA and how you handle people and how you make people feel, truthfully. There's so many nuances in the game of coaching today that don't deal with anything with the sport of hockey. It's just life. And so I had success there. And ironically, the way I got to Denver was one of the guys that I coached against in the league was good friends with the new coach that got the Denver job. They used to be goaltending tandem for the St. Paul Vulcans. His name was Mark Mazzolini, longtime college coach. And he said, "Man, this guy at Eau Claire, I coach against him. He's young, he's talented," whatever he said, which was really nice of him. And I got a call from Frank Serratori, who's now the coach at Air Force. Still to this day, he called and said, "Hey, I've been given your name. I want to interview you." And at the time, my first wife and I, we weren't married at the time. We had went and met with Frank and his wife in St. Paul and had dinner. And next thing I knew, we were off to Denver, Colorado, and coaching D1. So, ironically, just got it from I think a colleague more than myself, which was a very neat experience.
Was it common back then? This question kind of just came in my head. Like, I feel like nowadays when it comes to like younger people getting involved in the game, like for example, if you were to start in D3 now, maybe some schools shy away from taking a D3 coach because they just have that stigma attached to them, whether it's right
Mm-hmm.
or wrong. But like back then, did you think it was more easier for coaches like yourself to move up the ranks and jump levels because they weren't focusing on that as much?
Yeah, it was easier back then for sure, especially if your climb was decently elevated at a good pace. And my climb happened to be at Eau Claire in terms of wins and losses and what we were doing at that stage of Division 3. It was that league and the USHL. Like if you were even in the USHL way back in the day and you were elevating your team every year, you were having a chance to go on and be a Division 1 assistant or eventually become a Division 1 head. That's where it really slowed down though. Once you got to the Division 1 assistant job, then I thought to get to a head job at that time, based on the way life was, no cell phones, no computers, like just your chance of becoming a head coach, you really had to pay your dues a long time at the Division 1 level, in my opinion. Like you had to really be patient in that process. And my patience ran out. So I felt like, for me, it wasn't going to happen to be a Division 1 head coach very soon. So that's why my next step was to the USHL because I thought that would give me a better chance to advance myself into some of the minds of pro coaches and pro organizations.
In doing that transition, I thought one of the cool things you got to do is be the GM and head coach, so kind of tackle both sides of it. Given that experience that led you to the Indianapolis Ice there in the IHL, and then a couple of years down the road, you get your first NHL job, which I think you and many other people out there that's a dream to whether it's to play in the NHL, coach in the NHL, both work in the NHL. How did that Pittsburgh opportunity come about, and how was your experience working the 3 years there as an assistant coach with Pittsburgh?
It went really well. We had some good teams while we were there. I worked for a head coach named Kevin Constantine, who's coaching somewhere over by you in Europe right now, still to this day. Great coach. He got the job. Ironically, when I was with the Blackhawks organization in Indianapolis in the old IHL days, um, my head coach at Denver University at one point when I was working there, he told me, he said, "Man, you think like this." My good friend, happened to be another goalie. Mark Mazzolini was a goalie. Frank Serratori was a goalie. Kevin Constantine was a goalie. And he was like, you think like this Kevin Constantine guy. And I'm like, well, who's he? Didn't know him. And he was coaching at the time somewhere. I don't know if it was the USHL days or at the time in the IHL. He was with Kansas City. And so he said, you should go work for him. And I went and worked for Kevin one summer for 8 weeks. It didn't My first son Taylor was born 1991. I went up there and worked 8 weeks, and Kevin and I kind of hit it off, and eventually, our relationship grew from that point on. And then in '97, we'd known each other for 6 years. We'd spent a lot of time together on just tactical play, and Kevin was a kind of a guy ahead of his time. We were doing analytics in the '80s when there wasn't analytics. He was a mathematical genius type guy, so we were doing a lot of stuff like that, and he got the Pittsburgh job, and I was his first call. He said, I want to bring you with. And I didn't obviously have any experience, so I was the first call, but the last on the totem pole, which was fine with me. And I was very fortunate. I think I was 33 years old. Um, Felt very fortunate and humbled just to have that opportunity. It was a great experience.
Did you feel after those 3 years that you would have gotten another job right away, whether it was in the NHL or maybe AHL, like just based on like having that kind of 3 years with Pittsburgh NHL like on your resume?
Great question. I don't, no, not really. No, that again, still life was just starting to merge and change in our world, like relative to I think like I want to say 99-ish, maybe that I recognized the first like cell phone. Like so life was pretty simple back then, there wasn't a lot going on. And I didn't know a lot of people in pro hockey. I'd been 2 years with the Blackhawks, so I'd limited touches with a lot of coaches because there wasn't a lot of international things going on, like the coaches site and different things like that. You'd either know somebody from coaching against them or seeing them in a hotel lobby or something. But no, I didn't anticipate I would just go or stay in the ranks. I just kind of we got let go in Pitt, and then I was kind of like, okay, now I got to refocus my life and what am I going to do? And again, it was based on another connection. I coached a guy named Bruce Cassidy, who's now the coach of the Las Vegas Knights, and I'd coached him in Indy. And he happened to be the Trenton Titans coach, and he was resigning to go to Grand Rapids in the American League, and it was a brand new organization. And he called at the 12th hour. He said he was like, Wardo, like this job's a great job. It's kind of a hidden gem. I'm sure you want to stay in pro. I think I can get you an interview. And the guy snuck me in at the last interview. They'd already thought they were done, and I hit like obviously I did pretty well, and I got offered the job to go to Trenton. So that's how I got back into the game again, ironically through a connection and just through somebody that had some belief in me as a coach.
The common saying out there is it's all about who you know, especially
Yeah, totally
especially
is.
in the hockey world. I don't mean to skip too far ahead here, but obviously, you were in Trenton there, then you went back to the NCAA with the University of Wisconsin. Back to the coast after that, AHL as both an assistant coach and assistant GM, which obviously you're just adding to your resume, like learning about the both sides of the job, as I mentioned, when it comes to coaching and also like roster management and stuff like that.
Yep.
I want to talk about Abbotsford. Obviously, we talked about it off camera. One of the years you were a head coach there, my best friend, his first year pro, he signed with Calgary and was sent to Abbotsford, their affiliate there, Josh Juris.
Yep.
Um, and later, Corey Locke, I think, joined you like kind of near the trade deadline or halfway through the year there, another Burlington guy. But speaking to Josh, obviously couldn't say enough good things about you and what you taught him being his first pro year. He really stressed how, he would have meetings with you and it would be anything, whether it was on the ice, off the ice, your A suit he brought up versus your B suit, stuff like that, no shortcuts. He just explained how you were so detailed and you really took the time to teach him how to be a pro both at the rink and away from the rink. Is that something that kind of along your journey of working these various jobs in various leagues, pro and college, that you just kind of built your own formula and realized like, hey guys, like to get to the next level, this is what you need to do?
Yeah, I think for sure. First of all, nice of Josh to say those things. I think it was kind of really how I was raised. I still think you go back to your roots of who you are and what you are. And I had a dad, like I mentioned, my dad's name is Roy, and he's a coach, and he always, for whatever reason, he never coached for wins and losses. It was always a process for him. And he always talked about, well, we had, a decent ninth grade football year. He used to say that, but I felt we got a lot done with the people. He always called it the people. Like we got a lot done with the people. And it was always both on and off the field. And it was always stressed. We had a lot of players to our house for dinner and took them in and just, kind of helped raise them as young kids. And so I think when I went through the ranks, I felt like if it's a lifetime for me of coaching, my biggest impact would be to pass on what I know and how I can make their lives really the best they can be. And if we're fortunate to win more than we lose, that would be part of our process. But it wasn't the end all. So I was just as much into Josh as a man as I was as the player. And I felt that was really important that, I always felt like, if his parents or people or his agent would be like, well, he played for Troy Ward, like I'd like that to be a life lasting memory versus just a memory of that I was his hockey coach. And so that's the way it's always been. It is that way today. It happens in this office every day where I'm sitting. It's always about life and it's always about things that they can improve on or things that they're doing so well. I just want to compliment them on. And it's just been kind of always my approach, but that doesn't make me right or wrong. It's just kind of how I've always been.
That's awesome to hear, honestly, and especially for someone like yourself who has a lot of experience coaching at the AHL level, where it is about, everyone who's there, their goal is to get called up or to get with an organization in the next level or whatever it is. And that's awesome that you take pride in obviously developing them, sorry, both as an athlete, but more importantly as a person.
Yep.
Um, when you were in Abbotsford, for example, just use that team for example, like when you're getting these guys coming up and down constantly, like are you consistently communicating with whether it's the GM and for example in Abbotsford would have been Calgary or the head coach and talking about like when so and so comes down, like what you would or that sorry, what Calgary would want to see from them in the couple weeks that they're maybe coming down to you and how you can help them and vice versa?
Yeah, it's a nonstop process. And it's a tough process. I'll tell you what, it's an interesting one still to this day. I was in Abbotsford a week ago, a little over a week ago, ironically, doing this podcast with you. I was there evaluating the BC HL showcase. So I was there, and it happened to be in the Abbotsford rink. I'd never sat in the seats in the rink. It's 4 years there as a coach, so it was kind of a different, surreal situation. But I was back there, and I had a lot of time to reflect, and that was a time in my life and development where my constant conversation, whether it was with Brad Treleving my last year or Jay Feaster my first couple of years there, it was nonstop. Brent Sutter was the coach, and then Bob Hartley. So those were nonstop conversations. And I will say for everybody listening, for their own particular growth, like it's an interesting way you have to decide how you want to go about that. Um, I always took a path where I thought my job, I think the locker room in most places in the world is still the most sacred place left in the universe, where just people don't know a lot that goes on in there and what's said. That's kind of a private area where not a lot of people can get into. And I believed in always protecting the player. I think at pro level, I think there's a lot of people that want to be a part of a pro player's life, both good and bad. And so I've always protected my players. And that was a time in my life where I always chose to protect my players, and maybe not the best decision, but so for an example to your question, they would call and say, Josh Juris only played like 8 minutes last night. Like, what happened? And I would say, well, Josh unfortunately didn't have his best game. So he didn't get, the 12 or 13 minutes that you wanted. And it would be like, well, Mr. Ward or Troy or Wardo was like, he's got to play 13 minutes. And I said, I know that and I understand that. But I said, I also have a bench of people down here that are looking for me to make good decisions on behalf of their careers too. And I said, I have to live in this room. They have to live with each other, and I have to manage that group. And so I want to get him as 13. I will get him as 13, but I want him to understand at this point in his development, he has to earn that. And that's just not given. And so there were some difficult times during that time, I'll be honest with you, because I think it's important for development for everybody that's maybe a coach that listens. I could have went down the path and just played him as 13 minutes. And to your point earlier, the Corey Locks and certain players like that would be, making a lot of money in the American League at that time, maybe 300,000, and they wouldn't get their ice time or their points for their next career, then that affects my relationship with him. So I just felt I had to have a good feel on the bench of what needed to be done and how much needed to be done. And that's kind of how I guided through there. And to your point on the question, was I in constant conversations with the head coach at Calgary or the GM? And yes, I was. And some of those weren't always favorable in my way. And sometimes, but I think the players always felt like Wardo would back us and would support us, but he'd be fair. But what fair was different for everybody. And that's how I treated it.
So it's kind of the tough situation you're put in as those you know, minor league coaches because there's obviously a greater plan. And as you said, sometimes you can't always make the right decision for
Yep,
certain people, and it puts you in a tough spot. But
it
um,
does.
after Abbotsford, you end up so you at this point you've coached D3, D1, ECHL, AHL, NHL. Now you make the jump to the WHL with the Vancouver Giants there for one season. How was that kind of transition for you? Because obviously, now you're dealing with athletes, young men who are anywhere between the ages of 16 to 20, 21. Obviously, a little different from the program, and NCAA, I think, is on a whole normally a little older. But
Yep.
how was that? How was that season for you and coaching in that league?
It was great. Good people. Scott Bonner was the GM. He's a nice man. Good people. Um, Brendan Gallagher's dad was our strength coach. Yergi who's the assistant coach in Vancouver, is one of my assistants, kind of part-time. So just a bunch of good people, a good time in my life. Unfortunately, it just didn't last very long. And I was hired kind of by Pat Quinn um, through the Giants organization. Obviously, he was a big part of the Giants organization for many years. Kind of the owner looked up to Pat, and they were super close. And Pat kind of put the stamp on to hire me, and I got the job. And then, unfortunately, when I landed in Vancouver, Pat got sick and was in the hospital like 2 days after I landed there, and he passed away like I don't know, like 3.5, 4 months later. And that was a tough time for me because I didn't really know Pat, but I thought he was the reason why I was there. And tried to spend time with him on the phone. He was in a hospital. He wasn't doing well. And yeah, and then once he passed, it was shortly thereafter they let me go. So that was a kind of a tough stint in my growth as a coach because it felt like our team was making strides. We were a little below 500, but they didn't expect us to be very good. It was the organization was in transition. They wanted a good teacher. I think that's why Pat put me there. And I just didn't last very long. I lived in Tawasin, just outside of Vancouver there by the ferries, and it was great. The owner treated me well, But at the end of the day, they just decided to go in a different direction, and there was nothing that I could really do about it, obviously. But I enjoyed it because I enjoyed what I really enjoyed, to be honest with you, is there's a difference between coaching an American 16 to 20-year-old and a Canadian. And I thought I grew up a lot as a person and I understood what the differences are. And I would have never thought that much about it had I'd never had that opportunity. So it was awesome.
And after that opportunity, you did one thing that I think is always cool when you can go coach in another country. Obviously, you went over to the Austrian league there in Linz. From guys I know who play there, whether it was Locke, Mike Uzis was the goalie there for many years. They just talked about how beautiful that city was, and they were treated really well in the organization. How was the adjustment for you going over to live in Europe? Obviously, pick up everything and move, and obviously it's different type of hockey too, the European style. That league
Yep.
obviously is one of the better ones in Europe. But how was your 2 years there? What was the experience?
It was awesome. What made it easy was Jurgen Penker, my goalie guy, who was turned him into kind of more of an assistant coach. He was still our goalie guy, but I made him run the penalty kill and everything. Like, said, you got to get coaching and get on the bench. And he wasn't on the bench a lot before that. So he was there, and Mark Zooks. Both of them were just both assistants that I walked into when I got the job there. They made the whole experience fun. They made life fun. They made me getting to understand the culture, the city, everything just really easy for my wife and I through their wives and their families. So it was awesome. Christian, our general manager, was really great. I mean, to the day that I left the city, him and his wife showed up at my flat, if that's what I think we called it back then, a couple of years back. He showed up, helped me and my wife pack a bag, had a car there for us, drove us on the Autobahn through, to the airport in Munich but came and said goodbye and it's just first class. Like they were good people. I knew going over there from my agent, like the world would be like, because I had a 2-year deal. And a lot of times they said, they'll either re-sign you or not re-sign you. And it's based on some success or not success or just whatever. It's just the way it works over here. And so I knew kind of going in what the time frame would look like. So, but just an awesome experience. Great city, great fans, just good people. Um, it was a big part of my life and a big part of my growth, because I think now it's ironic that you're over there coaching in the DEL and you're young and you want to develop. Like if I could go back, maybe I would go back and if I'd been in Europe a lot earlier in my life, I think I would have been a lot better coach to the Europeans I had through my life in pro. I think the respect and understanding the language barriers and life barriers and things like that. I go back to Pittsburgh all the time. I'm like, the 1 year in Pittsburgh, we had 14 Euros playing out of our 20 guys in a lineup. And, we had Alexei Morozov, an 18-year-old freshman out of Russia who couldn't speak a lick of English. I'd be on the bench drawing diagrams, and at times, honestly, I was like, hey, Alexei, you got to learn the language. And then I got over to Linz and said that back to myself. And that was a difficult time. So you have a lot of respect and a lot of empathy for the situation once you go through it.
That is one of the biggest things is just even if the Europeans can speak English, like just sometimes how their tone is towards you or what their culture is like. We
Mm-hmm.
as North Americans maybe don't always understand it fully and think of it as maybe an attack or hey, this guy doesn't get it or doesn't want to learn, but it's actually
Right.
just how they are and it's just how they've been brought up. So it's I agree with that. If you could ever get some experience in Europe and then you continue on, whether it's coaching, general managing, and you obviously have people from different countries, then you can kind of
Right.
articulate how to handle everyone. Um, Another thing I thought that was cool that you did after Linz was you ended up being an NHL scout with the Vancouver Canucks there. Um, maybe just kind of touch shortly on, what was a typical week for you, month for you? Like, were you going strictly around North America? Were you flying over to Europe too to scout? Like, what was kind of your day to day there?
I was a U.S. amateur scout, so I was in charge of the whole U.S. Me and a guy named Wyatt Smith, who used to play some pro for a while, long time, played for the Gophers. Him and I were in charge of the U.S. He lived in Minnesota. I lived just over the border in Wisconsin. And so on average, I would see 26 games a month. So 26 nights a month, I'd be away from my house or back home if it was Minnesota high school. It was an hour drive to a game, or I'd be on a plane somewhere in the U.S. watching kids play for 4 days, 5 days, maybe a weekend. But on average, I saw for 3 years 250 games to 270 games live as a U.S. amateur. So that's a lot of work. Um, any coach out there would tell you if you could ever go be an NHL scout, I'd do it in a heartbeat. It's probably one of the bigger growth steps I've ever had, I think, in making me a better coach as I sit here today. Man, it was awesome. Like to get a level of patience and to get a level of understanding of how development should be looked at in a crock pot, not in a microwave. And we make a lot of mistakes with young players based on the fact that we believe that they should be, developing or trajecting faster than they really should be. So what scouting does is you have to project, and you really have to really kind of get into it because you're making major decisions for NHL organizations on who to draft, like let's say in the US for me. And man, it really changed how I sit here today at Minnesota State, how I look at players, all that stuff. It's really was just one of the greatest growths I had in the game at a lot of different levels, and would encourage any coach if they could ever do it to do it. It makes you a better coach.
I'm gonna have to steal that analogy. It's better to cook in a crock pot than in a microwave because that's very true when it comes to young athletes. Everyone has their own development path, development pace, I would say. And I
Correct.
know personally over here, like, sometimes you see a player once or twice and you might write them off, and then 4 years from now they're completely new player, and you could have had that player, for example. So that's a very good analogy. Couple more for you here. You've obviously been very gracious this early morning for you with your time. I don't want to take too much from it, but now
No
you
problem.
are the associate head coach at Minnesota State University there. As we mentioned, this is your second season. What types of players would you say you, as in the university, you and the head coach, like, are trying to recruit every year? Like, what is kind of the brand or the maybe attributes you're looking for in your athletes?
Well, we always say here that the person makes the player. So we really try and recruit really good people, and you can feel that. You're experienced enough where now you're over in the DEL and you have like a Canadian or American join you. I think you're going to know in a very quick time when somebody walks in the locker room in the fall, if well, not in the fall, August, they fit, or late July, they fit the criteria. They're just really a good, wholesome person. So we believe the person makes the player. That's the player we are looking for all the time. It's just a really good human that's probably his maturation um, would be ahead of his abilities. We look for people whose maturity is above their abilities because we feel that they have a sense of the things we're about to endure over the next 4 years, 3 years, whatever it is in the time frame, if they were to turn pro and play, however long that was. If their maturity is at a high level, then they can handle about what we're about to get into. So we believe that maturation should be ahead of their abilities. Um, but for us personally, and I think this is another great, it's another whole podcast. It'd be awesome to talk about, but it's what I'm intrigued about the game about is it took me like I'm 62 sitting here today. I think it took me till I was 52. Maybe you could say that Troy Ward's a slow learner, but to really figure out what hockey IQ is and find it in a player, it took me a long time, and it took me one person to walk into my life and teach me how to find it. And it changed the whole view of the game. So we as a staff here really, really focus on hockey IQ because we feel that whether he's a good skater, bad skater, small player, big player, if the IQ is high, then the ability to play with others is really high. Like he's going to be an elite player because he can share the puck and he understands when to arrive and how to arrive and all that. So we really put an emphasis on hockey IQ, almost to a fault at times. Um, but I think we're some of the few people in the game that understand how to find it in a player when you go scout. But I really learned that through scouting in the NHL, and like took one person in my life. His name was John Weisbrod, who was a GM in Vancouver, Harvard guy, smart man, He taught me how to find it in a player and what traits you look for going to a game. And then I kind of changed how I look at the game and how I look at players and where they're at in their development. So that's kind of our emphasis here, but we always say the person makes the player.
Obviously, the person, the character, I think is very important. That should always be number one. You raised a really good point, I feel, about the hockey IQ. A lot of times in our game now, it's getting faster every year. All the athletes they're training, everyone's just becoming elite skaters. What I have found in my short time in pro over here is sometimes that gets overvalued into the skating versus the IQ. So like you
Mhm.
could have a guy who's maybe a 5 out of 5 in skating and agility, but his
Yep.
hockey IQ is a 3 versus having someone who's a 5 in IQ and their skating's a 3 or 3.5. I've just noticed you have to be able to think the game because at the end of the day you'll be in the right position. You know how to read whether it's your line mate situations. So I definitely agree with that. Another question I had for you was it's not official yet, but I feel like it's going to be, and I've asked other coaches about this. What are your thoughts on the potential of this new rule coming in for athletes who play in the CHL being able to still be eligible for the NCAA after?
Well, I'm for it. Like, it's our world today. You got to adapt and you got to kind of go with things a little bit. So I'm not against it at all. Um, how you approach it with each, you in this case, let's just talk college hockey, how each university and their staffs handle it, it's going to be really important to fit their DNA and what they're building. Obviously, it's a little bit of philosophical standpoint from, I would say, maybe a staff, but really your head coach, how he wants to build his program. Because obviously the portal has changed our world a lot. Um, Now you have the CHL in, and those players are eligible here. It seems like next year it's going down that track to be eligible to leave the CHL and come play college hockey at some point in time, and vice versa. And I'm all for it. I just think how you have to really decide as a university and a program how you want to handle that, what type of players you want to bring into your program. Meaning, let's just use the word, do you want a short-term rental or do you want a long-term rental? Like that's what you're trying to do. Um, and and for an example, like the use Minnesota State this year, we took some guys in the portal, but our belief was if we could go in the portal and we could improve our team from players that were other universities, we took 3 sophomores that were now sophomores because we felt that for our culture to be right here, they needed at least 2 years in our culture for us to reach where we needed to be in their year 3, should they be here all 3. And so we went with young, where a lot of portal players are with some organizations, just 1 year players. They just rent them for a year and then they're gone. And it's just a constant thing. And we don't have that philosophical approach here. So every team is going to have their own approach. And I think that'll blend from the portal players, it'll blend right to the CHL. I think you're going to have some teams that are going to grab a ton of players and think that's the fastest way to improve their team. And I think you're going to have some collegiate programs that are going to tap the brakes, so to speak, and be very selective and be very patient and make sure that that person is the right fit.
I have to say I'm very curious about this just coming from when I was able to play college hockey. It was you pick one pass, so it was one or the
Right.
other, and I'm curious how it goes and if a lot of athletes will end up taking that route if they play, for example, 4 or 5 years CHL and then they decide to do another 4 NCAA. Like that's obviously a long development period, I would say. And then after that, they have to make a decision at 26, 27 if they're gonna go pro or whatever they're gonna do with their life. So very curious to see it.
Yeah.
Last one here. I like to end on this one. I think it's a good one for the audience here. What is one piece of advice or multiple pieces of advice you would give the younger generation out there?
Are we talking coaches, players?
Anything you can address them individually if you want, or just in general. It's up to you.
Well, for players, I think what would be important for me to say if you're a young player that's playing in Europe and let's say that you want to go to college or you want some exposure to the game over here and have some people look at you and be a part of it. Um, and it happens all the time, even in the US, like with US kids here. I honestly believe if you're going to find your way through the business in today's world, the best way to do it is through the right agency. And that's the biggest advice I could give to any player. And I have to give it every day. I get 10 emails a day, maybe from players as a recruiting coordinator here saying, I want to be a part of Minnesota State. And usually those 10 emails are all from individuals that don't have representation. That's just the only way they can get into the whole thing. So I'm for that. I'm not saying that every player should have an agent, but sitting in the chair I am today for kids to advance themselves to come over from overseas and play here or whatever, the fastest way to get into our life and into our fabric is through a representation. That's from the bottom of my heart. Like it's just the best way. And it's always been that for pros and my time in pro, like the agents that are really patient and good and they're good humans to deal with. You always like talking to them about their players, and that's part of a player picking just the right representation for them. But it's the fastest way to progress through the game, in my opinion. To the coaches, I would just say, like, you have to be patient. You just have to be patient. And the one thing is to really, to sum it up the best way, I would say is you have to be open-minded for growth. And you have to understand that we have two ears and one mouth. That would be where a lot of us, I think, in whatever our profession is, especially when we're young, we feel like, well, I've arrived and I've been here and I know a lot. And, the best advice I could give any young coach is just to understand that to speak less and hear more. You use both ears a lot more, and your growth will get a lot faster than to profess that maybe you have the right ideas and the right ways to go. I think you just have to implement those things as you go through the process slow. Um, because everything's too fast today. It's just everything's really microwaved and really super fast. And the game and the development of the game is still slow, and you should just go at the right pace. But that pace is different for everybody. So that'd be my advice.
Great advice for both parts. I would say for the coaches, just talking about like something I've experienced a little bit is you just kind of, you want to be that important person. You want to work your way up as quick as possible. And sometimes the patience isn't there because you'll see, for example, someone in another team where they've worked their way up quick and you're like, well, I could do that. And it is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And then for the player part, the representation, which I thought was awesome, is I do believe that players should have representation. The biggest thing I try to tell athletes when they speak to me about representation is you want to pick somebody who actually, one, has seen you play, knows what type of player you are, and also wants you to succeed for you and not just for the potential business, maybe dollars that it could bring them down the road. Like sometimes in my experience, I've run into agents where they tell me about a player and I've seen this player and they tell me what type of player he is, and it's complete opposite to what he is because they've never seen him. They've just picked him up off Facebook or
Yeah.
whatever, and yes, said, "Oh, I'll get
Right.
you a job," and stuff like that. So that's one thing for the young athletes out there, families as well. When you're picking those advisors, make sure you know they do their background on you, just like you do your background on them. But um, Troy, I
The
really
other
appreciate
thing,
you doing this.
yeah, I appreciate it. The only other thing I would really want to say is I think for coaches out there, it's all personal too, but the smarter the people you work for, the better your career will be. Like I sit here today, I'm super like I'm really fortunate to still be in the game 40 some years, but to be honest with you, to do right here, like for a lot of young coaches out there, like I've worked for some really bright people, way brighter than me. Uh, and I really grew, but that also, I got, it wasn't always a great career for me because people would say, oh, he's leaving this job again. He's going here and now he's going there. And, as you looked at my resume, there's like 3 year stints and then I'm moving. Um, but that was all because I felt I wanted to become the best I could at this business. And when you're in a situation like you today, dealing with athletes, the more experiences you have through the people you've worked with through your career, the better you are for that human at that time in his life. And I really believe that. So I've always been a guy that's moved a lot, worked for a lot of different people and grew. And um, the reason why I say all that to you is really interesting because a coach, when I was played for my college coach, he asked me what I wanted to do. And I said, I wanted to coach in the NHL. And he said, well, you played Division 3, like, you know, chances aren't very high, he said. And he said, his name was Wally. He said, well, Wally, he said, I wanted to go coach in the NHL, but I never did make it. And I kind of looked at him really seriously. And we were in his office at Wisconsin Eau Claire in like 1985. And he said, you really want it, don't you? I said, yeah, I want to coach in the NHL. I'm gonna prove to you that I can. And he said, well, if you want to do it, he said, I will give you one piece of advice. And he said, you better move every 3 years, 2 to 3 to 4 years, and you better work for bright people. And he said, you will get there because your DNA, the way you're wired, is you will get there, but you're going to have to really learn from people that are smarter than you. And you need to make good decisions on where you go in life and who you work for. And don't worry about the money. Don't worry about the money. Just work for intelligent people and good people. And to this day, if you did whole podcast here, we talked a little bit about my career. Like it has been that, and I think that in growth as a human or as a coach, like it's important you have a lot of experiences, and it's important you work for really good people. And I've just been fortunate. So whatever I have to give today isn't necessarily always because of Troy Ward. It has to do with all the people I've worked for and the players I've played with or coached. So, I would say that as a segue out of this really for all coaches is if you can work for really intelligent people and people where the money, it isn't about the money, it's just about growth, then you can probably get to somewhere where you want to be at some point in your life.
That's I would say the non-sexy part of the job, which people don't realize, is it is a lot of moving and you as yourself understanding that to build your own recipe, you need to take certain ingredients from everyone you worked with. And like you said, you consistently surround yourself with smart people. They would have different views, different ways of doing things, but you took what you really liked about them or what you found was successful and added it to your repertoire. And it isn't always about the money. Like that's what I think a lot of people out there fail to understand, or they'll give up because they'll try it for a couple of years and oh, I haven't made the high money yet, so I'm done. It's not worth it. But it is a grind. And one of my latest guests said at the end of the day, if you work hard enough and you're good enough, you'll make it. So
Yeah,
I
it's true.
really, I really believe that as well. But again, thank you so much for taking the time. It was awesome to talk to you. I hope you enjoyed going down memory lane. I know at least one person, Josh Juris, will be happy to listen to this episode. So we'll get at least one view. But I wish
Yeah,
you the best of luck this
he's a
season.
good man. Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I wish you all the success as a young coach and congrats on being over in the DEL. It's such a great league. We were fortunate to play some exhibition games there, and what a great development league for you and your growth in your career, and for all the coaches out there. Just stay with it, stay humble, and keep grinding.
Appreciate it. And on that note, until next week, cheers and ciao.